Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Valeria Romero. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a senior research lead at the research group at the Lawrence Hall of Science. And I am joining today from the ancestral lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Collins, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a senior research lead with the research group at the Lawrence Hall of Science, and I am presenting today from the ancestral lands of the Massachusetts people.
And hello, everyone. My name is Aujanee Young. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I am a research coordinator at the Lawrence Hall of Science, coming to you from the ancestral land of the Ojibwe people.
And thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to share some of our research findings from a 5-year study that we've been working on with the support of the National Science Foundation. Today we'll be, next slide please. Today we'll be sharing with you the research goals and study overview, and then diving into some of our research findings and implications of those findings. And then we'll share with you some questions that we're considering related to this study and next steps. And then we'll close out for today. So as I mentioned, this presentation is part of a 5-year-long research study that started in 2016 and has been exploring the broad implementation of the Beatles capacity building model for outdoor science programs. And you'll hear us refer to outdoor science programs as OSPs. Beatles stands for Better Environmental Education, Teaching, Learning, and Expertise Sharing. And our overarching research goal was to equip the field of outdoor science education with evidence of the quality, value, and impact of outdoor science programs. Today, we will focus on the first part of this 5-year study that explored aspects of the implementation of the Beatles professional learning model. In particular, we were interested in understanding the instructional practices and learning opportunities in outdoor science programs, and in exploring specifically how Beatles might support high quality pedagogy and other practices across programs. The Beatles project aims to build the capacity of outdoor science programs to facilitate learner-centered and nature-centered science learning experiences for youth. As you can see here, the capacity building model includes a leadership institute, which comprises of professional learning sessions, student activities, and other resources for program leaders and educators that draw on research-based pedagogical strategies and incorporate a range of science instructional practices as outlined in the next generation science standards. And the model is designed for program leaders and educators in outdoor science education programs. So with support from the National Science Foundation, our research group partnered with the Beatles program team to understand the implementation of their model. And so this presentation draws on three overarching research questions. Which components of the capacity building model were implemented across diverse outdoor science programs? What were the perceived impacts of these materials on pedagogical practices? And to what extent did implementation vary based on organizational features? And to answer these questions, we're drawing on 3 different primary data sources. The first is Post-Leadership Institute surveys, where we ask program leaders to respond to a series of questions that tried to understand their perceptions around science teaching and learning, and around their goals for using the Beatles materials and resources at their sites. In addition, we collected Leadership Institute implementation plans These were plans collected or that program leaders completed during the Institute, where they identified specific goals of how they might use the Beatles materials and resources to support capacity building at their organizations. And finally, we're drawing on end-of-year program leader surveys. These surveys were administered to program leaders about 18 months following their participation in the Leadership Institute. And the focus of these surveys was really to try to understand what the impact of the Beatles capacity building model was on their organizational practices, as well as perceptions around teaching and learning. So our current findings are based on 51 outdoor science programs that participated in the research study and that had attended the first 3 of the Beatles Leadership Institutes in August 2017, December 2017, and August 2018. One of the important things to note is that 68 programs participated in these 3 institutes, but we drew on data from 51 of those programs. Mostly because for consistency of data sources across those programs. So a little bit about the organizations that are part of the sample. So 44% of the programs primarily offered residential programming. And when we say residential programming, that really refers to organizations that provide overnight programming for youth that may range from 2 to sometimes 5 nights. 56% of programs were primarily non-residential programs. And this really refers to programs that might offer single day programs. And often there was some variation in the length of programs and the frequency of those are. But the key distinction here is that the residential programming is overnight. Next, in terms of learning goals, now these are youth learning goals. Program leaders identified the various goals that their organizations held that were specific to their learners. 82% of organizations identified goals related to environmental literacy. 68% identified goals related to science. And then 29% identified goals related to social emotional learning, and 16% identified goals that were really related to making connections to in-school learning or academic learning. Since we're interested in understanding both instructional practices and learning opportunities in outdoor science programs, and how Beatles might support high quality pedagogy and sustainable capacity building across programs, we focused on 1, identifying and describing capacity building goals across outdoor science programs. 2, which components of the Beatles capacity building model were implemented. 3, what was the perceived impact of the implementation of these components? And lastly, what challenges programs face in implementing Beatles materials and resources. So we look at these findings overall, and then we also look at any variation within these categories by program features, specifically looking at differences between residential and non-residential programs and learning goals. So a little bit about why we decided to focus on these goals. So we considered a wide range of organizational features around which to focus our analyses. Because we are studying a capacity building model to improve science teaching and learning, we chose to focus on 2 key variables that we believed would be related to differences in implementation of the model's components. And so that includes residential and non-residential status, and then science learning goals. One thing that we want to note is that contact hours are really hard to measure within this context. There's variability by program within organizations, by school group, and and that makes it really difficult to separate educational contact hours from other activities. The majority of residential programs last 3 to 5 days of intensive experiences. And so there might be like that would qualify as high contact hours. And then the majority of non-residential programs offer shorter bursts of experiences, whether those are 1-day visits, a combination of short 1 to 2 hour experiences, or lower contact hours overall. So here, I think within our sample, we're really focusing on residential and non-residential status. And within our sample, 44% were primarily residential, and then 56% were primarily non-residential. And then as a reminder, as we've already talked about, in terms of science learning goals, 68% of our programs explicitly identified a science learning goal, while 32% did not mention a science as a learning goal. So now we'll dive into our findings, and I'll start us off by talking about some of the capacity building goals that organizations reported, and then we will transition to some of the other findings. So as I mentioned, program leaders identified goals for capacity building in their implementation plans during the Leadership Institute. We obtained 52 of these implementation plans. And overall, when we analyzed the goals that organizations had specified, we saw a range of 1 to 37 goals with a mean of 5.24 and a median of 3. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the range in which organizations were thinking about how to integrate beetles into their organizations. And then as we looked through the implementation plans, we coded each of their goals in an effort to characterize them. And this was informed by the Beetles design principles and goals. For example, theoretical background for student learning or instructors' professional development, and also additional themes that we identified in the data themselves. So the first theme that we will talk about is related to student learning experiences. So most programs, about 82%, expressed at least one goal that had to do with the professional learning of instructional staff, and at least one goal that had to do with using instructional resources and student experiences. What this highlights is that organizations were prioritizing capacity building in areas that might directly affect learning experiences. And within these goals, there was a particular emphasis in direct changes in practice or systems that support professional learning, pedagogical approach, and ultimately student learning experiences. The next theme is related to theory and to practice. There were a number of programs that indicated desire to use beetles as a way to build up their understanding of research-based practices and underlying theory that supports professional learning or student learning experiences. So here we see that 54% of programs identified a goal that was related to instructors' professional learning, and 67% identified goals around building up their theoretical understanding related to student experiences. And so in this way, program leaders were particularly interested in building a conceptual understanding that undergirds the activities and professional learning modules. And then the next theme we'll talk about is related to organizational changes. So it's important to note that a little less than half of the programs also identified at least one goal for capacity building that was at the organizational level. Thus, thinking about ways in which the experiences of both their staff and visitors can be improved and supported. And we had about 1 in 5 programs express at least one goal that was focused on equity and inclusion, either for their learners, their staff, or both. To understand variation by whether a program was residential or non-residential, we looked at the proportion of each program type that named at least one goal within each category. Both types of programs were most likely to have goals related to improving student learning experiences through professional learning, instructional resources, or direct changes to the experiences themselves. But residential programs had slightly higher rates than non-residential programs, as you can see indicated by the blue highlighted cells. There were marked differences in other types of goals. Residential programs, for example, were more likely to name goals related to linking theory and practice in student experiences, and goals related to equity and inclusion. And non-residential programs were more likely to prioritize linking theory to practice in the professional learning, as well as broader organizational changes. And residential programs were also more likely to prioritize equity and inclusion efforts. We next looked at the variation in capacity building goals by whether an organization had identified a science goal or not. And just an important note here, or a reminder, is that not all programs shared their learning goals on their applications. And so that just might impact the way we understand this particular finding. But overall, in comparison to the previous analysis by residential status, we see that the differences here are much smaller, suggesting that whether a program had science learning goals had less of an impact on capacity building goals than did residential or non-residential status. With that said, when we look at this chart, we see that programs with science goals were more likely to name goals related to improving instructional resources or student learning experiences, as well as linking theory to practice in student experiences. And programs without an explicit science learning goal were slightly more likely to list goals related to equity and inclusion. So some of the key takeaways when we think about the capacity building goals are that overall program leaders exited the Leadership Institutes with a range of capacity building goals at their sites. Residential programs seem to place more emphasis on improving student learning experiences and equity and inclusion, while non-residential programs place more emphasis on organizational changes. And lastly, programs with science goals were more focused on student learning experiences, and programs without science learning goals were more likely to want to work on equity and inclusion. And now I will pass it over to Melissa to talk about the components of Beetles implemented by outdoor science programs and the impact.
Thanks, Valeria. So having gained some insights into program leaders' goals for capacity building back at their sites, we next wanted to see which pieces and which components of the Beetles model were actually implemented once they were out of the Institute and back at their sites. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Beetles model, Beetles has created a diverse array of materials and resources that are available publicly on their website, but also they are presented at the Institute, and program leaders get some firsthand experience trying some of them out. The resources are bucketed into two main categories: resources for program leaders and then resources for the educators who directly interact with the students. For program leaders, there are a number of professional learning sessions that are available as slides that can be presented directly to staff. And there are also implementation support materials such as how-to videos or guides or handouts that help program leaders think about how to best implement these resources at their programs. And within resources for educators, there are a number of student activities that educators can use directly with student learners, as well as instructional and implementation support materials, such as how-to videos or handouts. Today, we're going to focus on the professional learning sessions and the student activities. So looking within the professional learning sessions, we saw a very high uptake of these materials by programs. So overall, 86% of program leaders reported using at least one professional learning session back at their sites. The two most commonly used professional learning sessions are making observations and questioning strategies. Making observations provides tips and procedures for engaging students in rich observations of the natural world. And questioning strategies presents different kinds of questions, including broad and narrow questions, and explains how they can support or hinder student discussion. So program leaders overall seem to really value these two professional learning sessions. As you can see, there were 6 other professional learning sessions that were implemented less consistently across sites, and some of those will come up later when we discuss differences based on program features. But they range from teaching and learning that was implemented at 43% of sites, which focuses on understanding the cognitive processes underlying learning. It presents a model called the learning cycle that explains sort of a 5-step process for engaging students in science learning. And then the least commonly used session was constructing understanding, which is more based presenting research on how students learn. So looking into variation in usage of professional learning sessions, we are using the same 2 variables that Valeria described earlier. Looking within residential versus non-residential programs, we found that they implemented approximately equal numbers of professional learning sessions, each of them averaging around 3. Within programs with science learning goals or no science learning goals, we found that those with explicit science learning goals seem to implement slightly more professional learning sessions than those without, but this difference was not statistically significant. So overall, it seems like programs were implementing approximately equal numbers of professional learning sessions, about 3 on average. However, we did find that there were differences in which PL sessions they chose to implement. So looking within residential versus non-residential programs, we found that most programs, regardless of type, were implementing and making observations, but that there was more variability among the other professional learning sessions. Specifically, non-residential programs were slightly more likely to implement questioning strategies and the nature and practices of science, whereas residential programs were slightly more likely to use the promoting discussion professional learning session. And we interpreted this pattern to be suggestive of a goal of non-residential programs to maximize sort of the impact that they're able to have within a shorter amount of time by using very intentional questioning strategies and by engaging students directly in practices of science. Whereas residential programs with slightly more time to work with perhaps were more interested in developing opportunities for extended discussion among their participating youth. Next, we looked at variation in use of professional learning sessions depending on the learning goals of the program. And we found that overall, programs with a science learning goal were slightly more likely to implement the teaching and learning session, the nature and practices of science session, and the evidence and explanation sessions. And all of these were really heavy on the science learning content side of things, and indicated that the program leaders at these sites were trying to support deeper understanding of science and more extended science learning. Next, we looked at uptake of the student activities, and again, found very high rates of implementation overall. In fact, 100% of responding programs reported using at least one of the 29 student activities available. Activities were grouped within two sort of activity categories. Within or looking at these types of activities available, we found that the exploration routines were most often used. One activity I noticed, I wonder it reminds me of, is was reported, or at least, yeah, that was one of the most commonly used activities, and 100% of programs reported using at least one of these exploration routines. Likewise, discussion routines were extremely widely used, including the thought swap activity, or which is formerly known as walk and talk. Digging a little bit into the variation based on program features, we again found that number of activities were basically comparable regardless of program features. The residential programs implemented slightly more than non-residential programs. This was not statistically significant. Likewise, programs with explicit science goals seemed to implement slightly more, but this was also not significant. But we did see different patterns of usage in which which activities they chose to implement. Looking within residential, non-residential, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of activity was again most widely used by both programs, and thought swap or walk and talk was also used very commonly. There were some activities that residential programs were more likely to use than non-residential, like an exploration discussion routines and exploratory investigation. And these were all activities that promoted sort of longer term or longer engagement in an extended activity that might be related to having more time with the students. Likewise, programs with explicit science goals were equally likely to use the common activities, but programs with explicit science goals were more likely to use activities directly focused on science, such as nature scene investigators, or the case of the disappearing wild. So overall, patterns show high usage of materials related to making observations and using questions to support student discussion. But there were some potential patterns based on program features, where residential programs seem to place more emphasis on longer learning activities and progressions, while non-residential programs seem to prioritize maximizing impact in a shorter time. Similarly, programs with science goals seem to tailor their choices towards discussions within the context of the nature and practices of science, while programs without science goals focus more on nature-based exploration and peer discussion. I'm going to hand it off to Aujanee.
Thanks, Melissa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our findings related to Beetle's impact on pedagogical practices across programs. So this is looking at after participation in the institutes. Programs went back and we asked them to reflect on across the 3-point scale, what aspects of their pedagogical practices they felt needed improvement, were okay with, but felt they had room for growth, or if they felt it was an area of strength of their program. So we looked across 3 different categories encompassing 20 items. So we looked at student-centered discussions. So this was the way that programs ask learners to add to or engage in contributing to others' thinking. Then we looked at nature of science and practices of science. So this is mostly around asking learners to make and record detailed observations. And then we also asked them to reflect on their culturally relevant teaching practices. So this is how they encourage learners to make connections with their prior experiences, whether within their families or their community context. Next slide. So across these three categories, we noticed that program leaders reported a mean difference of 0.48. So that's about half a point, suggesting that the Beatles activity, the Beatles model does have significant impact on overall instructional practices. Next slide. And so when we compared across those same variables of residential and non-residential, as well as programs that have specific science goals or no specific science goals, we showed that there were approximately equal improvements regardless of those variations. And so overall, there were comparable improvements over the course of the year after participating in the Beatles Institute. Next slide. So the general takeaways from this is that the overall patterns show positive changes in pedagogical practices, and that's related to across all three of those categories: the student-centered discussions, nature of science and science practices, and culturally relevant teaching, and that those improvements occurred across programs regardless of program features. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about some of our findings related to challenges with implementing Beatles. So we asked programs to reflect on what some of their key challenges were when trying to integrate Beatles materials and resources into their program. We coded each of their responses to look for common themes. And so overwhelmingly so, time was reported as the greatest challenge amongst programs. So these reflections could have been around anything from having time with students, having time carved out within their program to do professional learning with educators, or some spoke to time in unspecified ways. Program leaders also reported challenges related to curricular design and implementation. So they raised concerns about weaving Beatles into their existing curriculum. And so we believe this challenge came up as a point of tension across programs based on how they design and execute their program curriculum. So in some instances, programs allowed for a significant amount of educator autonomy when it came to the development of their curriculum. And so this posed some challenges because it was a heavier lift for programs to integrate some of the Beatles practices into those types of curriculum. It also called for programs to think about redesigning their curriculum to integrate the learning cycle, which again could, depending on the variation within the autonomy of teachers within that program, suggests that that's a very complex process. There was also challenges that came up around conflicting goals and priorities. So some organizations had strategic plans or goals that focused on things like social emotional learning. For example, which may have limited their capacity to focus on some of the Beatles implementation. Other goals that could have been conflicting also maybe in relation to specific school district goals or emphasizing particular standards or content area for programs. And then finally, there were concerns over some challenges with staffing issues. So program leaders talked about having a range of staffing challenges related to high turnover, understaffing, or even staff resistance. So programs often shared that they operated on seasonal cycles or heavily relied on part-time, intern, or volunteer staff. And so these factors seem to be quite limiting in how the program leaders felt they were able to, how often they were able to offer professional learning and pass on those high quality resources and best practices to their staff within their program. Next slide. So there weren't any notable differences in challenges based on residential or non-residential programs. These challenges seem to go across programs regardless of that variation. And then programs without an explicit science goal were more likely to report challenges within staffing. So 42% of programs without science goals reported this challenge versus 4% of programs who did have science goals. Programs with explicit science goals were also more likely to report challenges with competing priorities. And we see this as being related to having to concentrate on specific standards and target points. And then both of the above relate to the critical role of stakeholders and buy-in, whether that is parents, school districts, or educational staff. So now we want to talk a little bit about thinking about the challenge of time in more detail, because this was such a salient challenge across programs. So this is a prominent challenge across many programs. Programs talked about the way that relying on staff who were not always available, this being a limitation in a number of ways. So with high turnover, there is the professional learning that may have occurred is not able to always be repeated with the same amount of frequency. And thinking about the time that staff are working, there's also limitations on being able to support paying for the additional time for staff to be able to get the professional learning. So these challenges can be difficult to implement Beatles or other professional learning when staff are not able to attend institutes or be able to increase the amount of hours that they spend on professional learning. And then we've also want to be able to mention that having change, institutional change is, it's a journey and it does take time. Many program leaders noted that Beatles is not just a plug and play model. It does require thoughtful implementation throughout time. Next slide. So overall, our findings suggest that using Beatles was effective in supporting organizational shifts in practice, particularly related to students' observations and discussions. And our findings also suggest that building capacity to shift practice requires organizational investment in times and resources beyond just the Beatles Institutes. So we are, as we move forward, we are thinking about some additional questions based on our initial findings. So one of the things that we're thinking about is other key organizational features that may influence the way that capacity building may be implemented in meaningful ways. We're also thinking about future capacity building efforts and how to better position organizations to implement those more broadly. And then thinking about to the extent that capacity building efforts translate to actual improvements for student learning and student outcomes. So that completes our presentation. We do want to say thank you to Beatles and all of those who participated in the Beatles Institute, taking these surveys and going on this long journey with us to better understand capacity building in outdoor science programs. And we also want to thank NSF for funding and supporting this work, and to all of those who have been involved in this journey. Thank you. And thank you all for joining
everyone.
us today.
Thank you.